A Suitor for Anne, based on the characters in Pride and Prejudice, Book 3 of the Happily Ever After series by Lisa Shipkiss. Prologue, April 12th, 1810. Thank you, Doctor. Thomas O'Connor shook the doctor's hand and watched the gentleman board his coach and head down the wet path away from Bluebell Cottage. After shutting the door, Thomas turned to face the small interior of the cottage in which his family had been inhabiting for the last 2 generations. Soon, the young man would become the sole occupant of Bluebell Cottage, placing the house under the care of an O'Connor for yet another generation. The room was dimly lit, with only the light from the window to brighten the space. There was a fireplace to the left, and a bed pressed up against the back wall. Under several blankets lay an older gentleman, whose eyes were closed and his breathing shallow. Thomas pulled up a chair next to his father's side and watched the man sleep. It had been some time since father slept peacefully. The gentleman's eyes fluttered open, and he let out a spasm of coughs. "Is it morning?" he asked after the fit was over. "No, father, midday. The doctor was just here to check on your health." Father nodded. Good man, good man. His eyes closed once more. Thomas released a sigh and began to rise, just as father's eyes opened once more. "I'm dying, Thomas," the older gentleman wheezed. Thomas shut his eyes and bit his lips. He need not be reminded of the situation before him. He sat back down and took father's hand in his. "You'll be just fine, father." Thomas spoke more to himself. "I know my time is soon," father continued, "but I am not afraid." Then he slowly craned his neck to look up at Thomas. "My son, it is you I fear for." "Why, father?" "You will be all to yourself here." Thomas shook his head. "No, father, for I have my men, my friends who work in and out of Rosings Park, and my gardens." Father gave a small smile. "You need not remain here, my son, as a gardener. Make your way into the world, as others have done before you." Again, Thomas shook his head. "No, father, I wish to continue the legacy that you and grandfather started many years ago. My loyalty is to Rosings Park until the end of my days, as is yours." Father was overcome by another coughing fit before speaking. "You make me proud, Thomas. I am a lucky father to have you for a son. Never forget that you are a wonderful young lad, a good man. Continue to make me proud." Thomas felt tears burn his eyes, and he swallowed a lump in his throat. "Yes, father." The older gentleman then patted Thomas's hand. "Do not leave her alone. At least find yourself a wife, a good wife, and together you may have a family to bring joy to your life as you have given me." Thomas had to shake his head yet again. "I cannot stray from my duties as head gardener, father. I must also add that no woman would ever find me worthy." Father winked. "Oh, she's out there, the lady who is to steal your heart. You just don't know it yet." Thomas chuckled. Father always knew how to make him smile. The older gentleman coughed once more, then closed his eyes. "I fear I need rest," said he. "Of course, father." Thomas rose at last and went to draw the curtains closed, so as to seal off any sunlight on this overcast day, and father could sleep. Outside, the grass was wet. The daffodils and primroses along the path to the cottage were in bloom, their colors more vibrant beneath the touch of dew. Thomas could never imagine living away from such beauty, even if the land and cottage were part of Rosings Park. His family has occupied the property for generations, and Thomas intended to keep it that way for many years to come. As for a wife, Thomas could think of no woman who could ever tempt him. He rather looked forward to being an old bachelor in Bluebell Cottage until the end of his days. Chapter 1. May 15th, 1813. "My lady, would you like the black one or the gray one?" Anne de Bourgh looked up at her companion, Mrs. Jenkinson, and furrowed her eyebrows. "Whatever for?" It was a Saturday, and on the weekends Anne preferred to be in her nightgown. It was much less effort getting her in and out of a dress. "I beg your pardon, miss, for I have forgotten to communicate that your cousin Mr. Darcy is here to see you." Anne was all confusion. It was not like her cousin to call upon her. It was typical for all and any guest to visit her mamma, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. "Oh, well, in that case I shall wear the gray one." Although Anne admired vibrant colors, such as the ones in paintings and in the gardens, only dark shades sat well upon her fair-colored skin. She had the misfortune of having been born weak or an invalid. Not only was her birth premature, but she had been breached in her mother's womb, causing the midwife and others to twist and turn her until the oxygen-deprived Anne came into the world. The traumatic birth forever left a mark on the lady. Anne often wondered what her life would be like had she been born full term and in the correct position. Perhaps then Mamma and her late papa would have been able to give her sisters and brothers to play with. Instead, Anne was an only child, and her only companion was Mrs. Jenkinson, a widower who doted on Anne far more than her own mamma. "Why does my cousin wish to speak to me?" Anne asked, after Mrs. Jenkinson sat her by her toiletry. From the mirror she could see her friend stiffen. "Is it Mrs. Darcy?" she inquired. Her cousin had recently married. Perhaps his wife had taken ill. "Oh, no, my child." Mrs. Jenkinson brushed through Anne's hair and began setting it with pins. Afterwards, the older woman grabbed the matching bonnet. "Must I wear that old thing?" Anne asked. Mrs. Jenkinson stared at her with big, round eyes. "Of course, my Anne. Your mother insists you wear a bonnet when you go into the sun. It is to protect your skin." Anne sighed. "The bonnet makes me look like Mamma." "Is that not a good thing, my child?" Anne looked down at her hands. She harbored very little affection for the woman she must call Mamma, therefore she detested looking like the old lady. She much preferred to be the spitting image of the woman who had been more of a mother to her entire life. Shame plagued at Anne. These were not good thoughts to have toward one's own parent. Two big, warm hands wrapped around Anne's small, thin ones. "Would you like a different bonnet?" Mrs. Jenkinson asked. "I can go to town later today and see if I can purchase one of the latest fashions for you." Anne looked up and saw a twinkle in Mrs. Jenkinson's eyes. "I cannot burden you, sir," replied Anne. "Not at all," said Mrs. Jenkinson. "It brings me joy to be able to provide for you. You are my charge, and I will care for you until you no longer need me." Anne gave a small smile. She could not imagine her life without her companion, a woman who would do anything for her, including give her maternal care and affection. "Then in that case, I should like a blue bonnet and gloves, such as the ones we saw in town the other weekend." "Of course, my lady." Anne allowed Mrs. Jenkinson to tie the gray bonnet on her head and help her into her wheelchair. Before they exited, however, Mrs. Jenkinson instructed Anne to take her medication. Then the older woman pushed her charge out of the room and down the corridor toward the drawing room. Upon entering, both women were greeted by a gentleman who was standing by the window. "Cousin Anne." The gentleman bowed to Anne and Mrs. Jenkinson before making his way over to them. "Cousin Darcy." Anne could only nod at the gentleman, whom she called Fitzwilliam in their youth. It was now more proper to call him by his family name, Darcy. "How do you do?" Darcy inquired. "I am well, thank you." Anne was wheeled over to the settee, where her cousin took a seat. "I am certain my aunt has informed you of my being here," said Darcy. "Not at all," replied Anne. Darcy paused, looked over at Mrs. Jenkinson, and then proceeded to say, "Oh, well, I've come to see if you would like to take a turn about the gardens. They are beautiful this time of year." "Indeed they are." Just as Darcy and Mrs. Jenkinson rose, a valet opened the door and an older, matronly woman strolled into the room. At the sight of the stern-faced woman, Anne felt herself shrink into her chair. Any words she may have wished to speak to her cousin and companion evaporated from her tongue. The austere woman met all three of them with narrow eyes. "Fitzwilliam," the lady began, "you are early." "Yes, I prefer promptness to tardiness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh," replied Darcy. "Yes, I am well aware," said the lady, taking her own seat away from the three. There was a cold, still silence before Darcy began. "I have come to accompany Anne on a walk." "Ah, yes, do take her. She needs it." Again, more silence. "See to it Anne gets plenty of sunlight and fresh air," Lady Catherine continued. "Yes, ma'am." Darcy rose, as did Mrs. Jenkinson, and with Anne they left the drawing-room. The gardens at Rosings Park were blooming beautifully. There were beds of foxgloves and peonies, some of Anne's favorites. "Your mother has done a wonderful job with the gardens," Darcy began. Anne flinched. She knew her mother did so much as to instruct the head gardener and his staff to see to the gardens. "I believe the credit goes to our gardeners," Anne replied. "Yes, you are right. If it were not for the gardeners, no such beautiful landscape would exist. They strolled on silently for some time before Anne felt she must add on to the conversation. I must congratulate you on your recent marriage. Forgive me for not attending the wedding, for I had taken ill that day. Not at all, Darcy replied. Our wedding had to be postponed due to other circumstances. Perhaps then you would have been in better health. However, you are much recovered, are you not? Anne replied, I am. Perhaps when I visit next, I shall bring my wife. That would be lovely. I should like some company. It is much too quiet here. Darcy chuckled. Are you telling me, cousin, that you do not enjoy the peace and quiet? Anne stared at her cousin. Never had she heard him laugh before. There was even a brightness to his features. Marriage did him well. I much prefer a small house, Anne replied. I know I shan't inherit Rosings. In that case, I should like a small cottage or other in my future. Speaking of your future, said Darcy, your mother has asked that I introduce you to some gentlemen friends of mine. Again, Anne stared at her cousin. Whatever for? Well, frankly speaking, dear cousin, to introduce you to society. I see no need for an introduction, for I am 26. Anne watched as her cousin's face grew pink. He did not meet her eyes as he said, I speak of marriage. The young lady knew not what to say. Marriage was a subject that she only overheard her mamma and Mrs. Jenkinson speak in private. She would have thought they planned an arranged marriage for her by now, but none has occurred, though Anne was no fool in the knowledge that mamma once planned on Darcy being by Anne's side. However, fate had its own course for Darcy. Anne only hoped it would be so kind to her. She did not mind being a spinster as well, with Mrs. Jenkinson as her companion forever. I see no reason as to why I should marry, said Anne. A union in marriage is not just about yourself, dear cousin, said Darcy. You must consider the trials and sacrifices of our ancestors, what role you play at present, and what you wish to leave behind with your descendants. Was Darcy reinforcing that a woman's role was only to bear children? I do not understand. I simply mean to say you need to start considering others before yourself. Anne looked up at Darcy, who was walking next to her chair, yet his attention was on the walking path. Her cousin was tall and broad, and was considered tall, dark, and handsome by many, but he was much too stiff for Anne's liking. Darcy reminded her of mamma. Anne cringed. She much preferred a man light on his feet, with an amiable spirit, or no husband at all. Why must I marry? Anne contemplated. Society would say, to fulfill your duty, but I say to have love, joy, and happiness for the rest of your days. Anne preferred Darcy's answer, but she knew that even as an invalid, her role was to fulfill a duty. Love, joy, and happiness were out of the question for an heiress as she. Forgive my bluntness, for I know the pressures of engagement and marriage, Darcy continued. I only wish to please my aunt. Anne lowered her eyes. Everything was always about mamma. No one ever considered what her own thoughts were, how she felt, and what she had to say on any given subject. As they approached the perennial garden, a red-haired gentleman could be seen kneeling in the flower beds. At the sight of the party of 3, the gentleman rose to his feet. Good morning, master and ladies, said he. Good morning, Mr. O'Connor, Anne greeted him, and she noticed the gentleman flinch slightly. Ignoring the behavior, Anne introduced one gentleman to the other. Mr. O'Connor was their head gardener at Rosings Park. You have done a fine job with the gardens, Darcy said to the gardener. Thank you, sir, but I only do my job. Whatever Lady Catherine de Bourgh wishes to grow, my men and I produce it. Have you any roses? My wife is fond of flowers. Perchance I could pick a rose for Mrs. Darcy. By all means, Master Darcy, please do. These gardens are here to please everyone at Rosings. Let me show you what we have in season. Thank you. They strolled into the garden, and Anne's thoughts only rose in one direction. Why must she marry at all? She much preferred a life with only herself and Mrs. Jenkinson as her companion. Chapter 2. O'Connor walked the 3 guests into another garden where a variety of roses bloomed every year. The English rose was resilient, always able to weather the storm by blooming on time and remaining until the first frost. The head gardener thought it was a splendid choice for Mr. Darcy. I have seen you since we were young lads, Master Darcy, but I do not recall a marriage. Indeed, O'Connor and Darcy must be relatively close in age, for O'Connor has seen the children of Rosings Park since he could first recall memories. It was most recently, replied Darcy. My wife and I had a dual wedding. My best friend is also married to my wife's sister. O'Connor thought his eyes would shoot out of his head. Never has he heard of a dual wedding, especially not one between friends and sisters. Congratulations, Master Darcy, and to your friend. Thank you. And pray tell, have you a wife or children? O'Connor shook his head. It is only myself at Bluebell Cottage. Do not despair, for a lucky woman will make your acquaintance. I do not believe marriage is for me. I much prefer my work and have little time for romantic connections. Darcy chuckled. I once shared your same views, yet upon making the acquaintance of my wife, my mind was altered. O'Connor was about to speak when a soft voice interrupted the two men. It belonged to a being whom O'Connor never heard speak before. When she addressed him earlier, the head gardener was shocked to learn that the heiress of Rosings Park was not mute. Cousin Darcy is to introduce me to his friends, said Miss de Bourgh. Perhaps he would be so kind as to introduce you to the ladies in his circle. O'Connor watched Darcy go pink in the face at the lady's suggestion. Was she teasing the man? It amused O'Connor to know that Miss de Bourgh had a sense of humor. I assure you I need no such introductions, said O'Connor. However, I thank you, my lady and Master Darcy, for the kind offer. O'Connor found himself in a natural conversation with Darcy as they spoke of many subjects, from rotating crops to sports they enjoyed as young boys. Mrs. Jenkinson took this opportunity to stroll Miss de Bourgh about before returning to the men. Darcy then apologized for taking up the gardener's time and excused himself. After the three members of Rosings Park left, O'Connor returned to his previous duty. As he worked, the head gardener's mind continued to return to Miss de Bourgh. In all his years working in the gardens, O'Connor had never heard the lady speak before. He had assumed she was mute. However, at present, he questioned if the young woman was a shy, quiet type, and only those closest to her were given the opportunity to hear her soft voice. Did the morning's interaction make a change in his position and the relationship to the family of Rosings Park, then? Although O'Connor was doubtful he would see Master Darcy and the ladies again, he enjoyed the conversation with Darcy immensely and suddenly wished for companionship. Bluebell Cottage was too quiet without another O'Connor. Thank you for listening to this excerpt of A Suitor for Anne, based on the characters in Pride and Prejudice, Book 3 of the Happily Ever After series by Lisa Shimkus.